Good afternoon, I'm Noelle Yukas. You know me already. And this is part 2 of the Basics of Academic Writing series. That sounds very official, but this is just the second half because I know you don't want to sit for 2 hours in this room. Okay, today we're just going to be going over grammar and style and clarity issues. Now these are the same kind of genre that the earlier part of the series dealt with, and that is areas you don't want to be caught doing incorrectly, if that makes sense. Oh, is it locked? Do you want to unlock it for them? Come on in, please have a seat. So your workbook that I've provided you has far more categories than the ones I'm about to go over. I have selected these as being the most problematic areas for most students. Some ESL students have other problem areas, but I tend to think that overall these are the ones that need the most work. So today we'll be going over conjunctions. Makes you want to sing School of Rock tunes, right? Yeah. Pronouns and prepositions. You can save any questions you have to the end, and I'll be able to answer anything that fits into a different category. So, without further ado, conjunctions. I'm going to give you a quick review of sentence construction. Now, this may seem very basic to you, but the reason I'm showing this to you is because when we're using conjunctions, we're usually conjoining different clauses. And a clause requires certain things. So the basic sentence construction is a subject and a verb, or a subject, verb, and object. Very simple. But to be able to understand whether you have an independent clause, which would be one of these two, or a dependent clause, a clause that relies on this basic construction, this is what you need to see. So when someone talks about subject-verb agreement, you want to look to your subject, and you look at the noun there, and you want to make sure that your verb agrees in number, agrees with the number of the noun. Okay, here are the coordinating conjunctions. These are the simplest of our conjunctions, but it's easy to botch the execution in military speak. So we have for, and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. We love them. I would say that for is used a little less than it used to be. You'll see a lot of antiquated writing with for as a conjunction. So here is one of the first guidelines. Use a coordinating conjunction to connect an independent clause, you saw the formula earlier, with a dependent clause without a comma. So you want to do this. Local management understood the corporate directive but failed to comply. As you can see, what comes after but is not another subject. It's a verb that follows from the subject in the first clause, local management. So always leave the comma out of this kind of construction. Here's one more example. Upper management understood the employees' concerns, yet ignored them anyway. Use a coordinating conjunction to connect an independent clause to another independent clause with a comma. The company president resigned, comma, and the vice president took his place. Now, if you don't use a comma here, you can kind of get lost in the sentence. It's a great thing for the reader. I always say that you use commas when you need them, and you don't use them when you don't, because it just really helps the reader understand what you're saying. Here's one more example. He did not accept the media's interpretation of events, so he avoided watching the evening news. As you'll notice, there's a comma right there before so. Subordinating conjunctions are a little bit trickier. I know you've all seen them, and they're really fun to use. They are really meant to create a logical connection between two ideas, so between two clauses. So if the sentence begins with a subordinating conjunction, use a comma between the clauses. So what we want to do is have some kind of marker in the middle of the sentence that tells me where one clause ends and the other begins. In this kind of construction, that point is the comma in the middle. So provided his promotion interview goes as planned, comma, Steve should advance in rank by the end of 2015. What you don't want to do is eliminate that comma in the middle, because it just feels like it's a run-on sentence, even if it isn't. Here's an example of what not to do. Whereas most employees prefer to take vacation during the holiday season, Jake prefers to vacation in the spring without a comma. It makes it really hard to follow. So the alternate is true. I'm going to go on to this one. If you are conjoining two clauses with a subordinating conjunction in the middle. So Jane will read the book even if she is not required to do so. When you have a subordinating conjunction in the middle of your sentence, it is all you need. It is what divides one clause from the other. You do not need a comma in this case. What happens when you add a comma is that you create choppiness in your sentence. Here's another way to use, well, this is actually a rule of what not to do, I should say. If the sentence begins with a subordinating conjunction, do not follow that conjunction with a comma. This is for a different kind of conjunction that I'm about to talk about in a minute. So, although the employees were upset about the new policy, morale remained high. You don't want to start with although, comma. It's not the proper way to conjoin the conjunction to the clause. So this is the kind of conjunction that you would follow with a comma. It's called a conjunctive adverb. Don't get too caught up in the name. Just we have these three categories of conjunctions to better understand the punctuation involved. So these are the fancy ones, the really long ones, the ones that transition between paragraphs, between ideas. So you can use them either within a sentence or in between sentences. Always use a comma after a conjunctive adverb. This is in contrast to the subordinating conjunctions. So here's one example. Private Young neglected to follow his chain of command, semicolon. Consequently, comma, he received a letter of counseling from his superior officer. Here's another example. This time I've punctuated with a full stop in between the clauses. The village suffered an influx of mosquito-borne infections, period. Thus, comma, the World Health Organization provided aid in the form of mosquito nets and immunizations. So you can see you have two options when you're punctuating with a conjunctive adverb. So you can either use a semicolon and use the conjunctive adverb with a comma, or you can punctuate fully with a period and start the sentence with the conjunctive adverb. One other special way to use conjunctive adverbs is to place it in the middle of the sentence. But when you do so, you have to separate it with a set of commas. So the company president, consequently, took an impromptu trip to South America. Here's another one. The trip, however, did not go as planned. Now, keep in mind that you can't just place it anywhere in the sentence. It wouldn't make sense to say the trip did not go, however, as planned. That would be a little bit choppy. You could choose to maybe place it after the whole did not, however, go as planned. But you know, you have to be very choosy where you do this. It doesn't work in every single situation. Okay, without further ado, we're going to be practicing with conjunctions. I'm going to have you all do this separately instead of in groups. Pick either a subordinating conjunction or a conjunctive adverb and link two clauses together. Once you're done, go to the whiteboard and write it down. Because of the time issue we have today, please take about 2 to 3 minutes or just go ahead to the whiteboard and write your sentence. Please refer back to your book if you have any questions, or you can raise your hand. I'd be happy to come around. All right, here's the first example. I'm excited to finish my thesis, semicolon. However, oh, you corrected it yourself. It's a little.
Could have been a period there.
It could, well, that's fine. I wasn't going to immediately correct you. Okay, I'm excited to finish my thesis, semicolon. However, comma, I still have a lot of work to do. Appropriate use of the conjunctive adverb. What do you guys think?
Yes.
This is funny. All right. Lieutenant Brooks wrote his sentence on the board, period. Meanwhile, comma, the camera continued to roll. What do you all think? Meanwhile, yeah. This is a conjunctive adverb. Very good. The project was, however, not cost effective. You guys think? This is an example of how to insert however separated with commas in the middle of a sentence in one clause. But I think that works. What do you guys think?
I've heard conflicting guidance with however. Like I've heard, like with Forrest's sentence, it says, I'm excited to finish my thesis. It's kind of a positive statement. However, and then there's something that contradicts it, and I've heard that.
This would require there to be a statement here that this would be in contrast to. So it is contextual. Okay. So I was hoping to see two clauses so you could see the relationship, but if you had a sentence that was in contrast to this, it could be just as effective.
This is like a softer contrast. That is quite a slap.
So if we had another sentence with a period or a semicolon, and then we had, however, the project was not cost effective, you could do it either way. But you definitely want to make sure that this follows from something that would be in contrast. Okay? And here is the last one. Parties are always fun, semicolon. However, comma, not all parties end well. Yes. I think that's a universal truth. What do you think? Now, all of you chose to use conjunctive adverbs. I challenge you to use subordinating conjunctions. Practice using them because they're a little bit tricky. Okay? We will now move on to pronouns. What's a pronoun? You guys know what a pronoun is?
The word that substitutes for a noun.
Okay, yes, exactly. We substitute for nouns. It may seem like such a tricky, it's such a simple area to understand, but believe it or not, this is one of the very easy pitfalls, especially writing a thesis. So we have so many different types of pronouns in English, and it can be quite a challenge. So here are some relative pronouns: who, whoever, which, and that, which we will focus on in a little bit, whom, whomever, and whichever. So use relative pronouns to define nouns more specifically. So you're going to either give extra information or just a bit of information so I understand what the subject is or the object. So use who, whom, whoever, and whomever to refer to people. Always, always, always use these to refer to people. People are whose, not that's. Okay? So please find the person who won the lottery, not please find the person that won the lottery. It's an easy pitfall, but keep it in mind. Make sure that people are people in your sentences. Now, this should be a giant cross out. I did have an animation there at one point and it disappeared, but okay. So who rescued who? I love the SPCA. They do good work. But what should it really say? Who rescued whom, right? Who is the subject? Whom would be referring to the object of the sentence. So keep this in mind. I'm sure you won't forget this, and when you see someone driving by with the who rescued who, you're going to go. Because that's what I do. But good organization nonetheless. So use who to replace a subject and whom to replace an object of a sentence. First one, who caused the problem? We are referring to the doer of the action, that would be the subject. The person to whom you wrote the letter never responded. Now this may seem very formal. If you don't like how formal it sounds, restructure your sentence. Simple as that. Use the pronoun that to introduce essential information. This is one of the most confusing things about pronouns, that and which. But essential information is the information I need to understand exactly the specific subject we're talking about. Now, I actually did something different with this particular prompt. The first one, I would say, is a good one. The company that signed the agreement is based in Chicago. All of this is necessary for me to understand which company we're talking about, right? The middle one, I'm going to pose the question, do you think this is a good way to write this sentence? Technically, it's punctuated correctly, but does it give the right information about the company? The company, which signed the agreement, is based in Chicago. Yeah, I think everything's important here. The company that signed the agreement. So you may punctuate something correctly, but you need to analyze whether I need this phrase right here attached to the subject to understand it better.
That makes it sound like the agreement's the most important part of the sentence.
Well, it's just, it kind of feels like the agreement is tangential. It's not really that important, maybe. The company is based in Chicago. Is that really what you want to say? So my point here is that you make sure that you attach phrases that provide meaning for the subject to them, and you don't section them off with non-essential phrases, okay? So this example down here is definitely not how you want to punctuate the sentence. The company, comma, that signed the agreement, comma, is based in Chicago. Always use that with essential phrases attached to the subject. Use which phrases sectioned off with commas, and it's separated from the subject. So this is a really good example of a which phrase. His new book, comma, which is much funnier than his last one, comma, was released today. Now you could tell in this sentence that I've added information that is really non-essential. It's additional information. It's a nice detail in the middle, but I know about his book and that it was released today. That's the important part of the sentence. You have to make that judgment call. We'll move on to personal and possessive pronouns. These are very tricky, and for the most part, you all are in the Navy, so you guys might fight me on something here in a minute. But I'll hold that thought for a second. Ensure personal and possessive pronouns agree with the nouns they are replacing in number. Here's an example. Congress is at a stalemate. As usual, it can never pass a bill. It's not a they, right? As usual, they can never pass a bill. You could actually change the subject and say members of Congress are at a stalemate. As usually, they can never pass a bill. So make sure that your pronoun, in this case it was they or it, agrees with the subject. And you can change it however you want. If you don't like how the first sentence sounds, you can just simply change your subject to members of Congress and make it a they. But don't say Congress is at a stalemate. As usual, they can never finalize a bill. Here's one that's a little controversial, but I would argue that agreeing in number is the most important thing here. If the noun is gender neutral, ensure that the pronoun agrees in number. So I would say that all of these are acceptable. A sailor, who can be either a female or a male, has to remain alert on his, and I would say, or his or her watch. You could say a sailor has to remain alert on his watch. You could say a sailor has to remain alert on her watch. I would say you have to make the choice, if you're writing a paragraph, to be consistent within a paragraph. I would say that to say their instead of his or her or his or her is incorrect because it doesn't agree with the subject of the sentence. This is the point that's going to be, oh, do you have a question?
More later.
More later?
Yeah.
Okay. This one down here is going to be controversial for some of you. This is my advice. Use gender-neutral pronouns when you're referring to vessels, including ships and aircraft. Now, I know you are writing memos, you're writing internal documents in your jobs. Go ahead, call a ship a she. I don't necessarily like it, but when you're writing an academic paper, try to refrain from that. That is a tradition in the Navy and sometimes in the Air Force, but in your papers, just call the vessel an it, okay? Use singular pronouns when referring to a single organization. We kind of went over this before, calling an individual organization an it versus a they. But when you're talking about ownership, it can be a little bit tricky. And it's a temptation to use their rather than its. The Department of Defense has been charged with protecting its service members at home and abroad. So keep that in mind as you're showing ownership or if you're just using a simple personal pronoun. These ones are the trickiest by far. They're indefinite pronouns. It means they're gender neutral, and we have a whole bunch to choose from. We have ones that are for singular subjects, we have ones that are for plural, and we have ones that could be for either. So here are a couple examples that should help you sort out everything in those murky waters. Use indefinite pronouns to indicate non-specific subjects and objects, and make sure they agree in number. So you could leave out the pronoun altogether. That's what my first example is to show you. Someone needs to pick up the mail. You don't need to say his or her, but you could just simply say the mail. The alternative would be someone needs to pick up his or her mail. But you would never say someone, that's an individual, a singular subject, needs to pick up their mail. Here's another example. Each, which is singular, each class has a different midterm schedule. That's a simple way to do it. But if you insist on using a pronoun, the next one is the best way. Each class has its own midterm schedule, not each class has their own midterm schedule. Just keep in mind, most of the time we will pick in these lists the singular ones and try to make them agree with a personal pronoun that's plural. It's just not correct. Use an indefinite pronoun to indicate nonspecific subjects and objects. So here are a few examples for the others. No one knows the answer. There were two possible definitions. Both were correct. Both is plural. Though many are capable, few actually vote. And all, and here when I say all, I'm referring to the teachers, so I can make it plural. Review class material at midterm. Now on to prepositions. Ensure that your verb agrees with your subject despite the presence of a prepositional phrase. So this is what I mean. We have experts here. Experts is the subject in this sentence. But now I have in the field, I'm giving a little bit of information in the form of a prepositional phrase. Make sure that you are agreeing with this, the subject, rather than this, the prepositional phrase. So experts in the field explain this phenomenon, not explains this phenomenon. And then also make sure you take into account whether your subject is a non-count or a collective term. In this case, literature is a singular collective thing. Literature about civil-military relations has been expanding. It would not be have been expanding. So there's a whole list of non-count nouns. Explore those. They can be a little bit tricky. Style and clarity. We're moving on to the next section. We will be covering verb tense, active voice, modifying phrases, parallelism, and signal phrasing. Verb tense. Now, what citation styles will you all be using in your different fields? IEEE. You? Chicago? Okay, so IEEE will default to certain rules in Chicago. And that's good because I'm not going to fixate on APA right now. APA has very specific rules about the verb tenses you use to discuss elements of methodology and areas in your literature review. Overall, these are just general guidelines for picking the right verb tense when you're talking about your material. Use the simple past tense to describe a specific or definite past action. So each incumbent received the report. The Civil War resulted in thousands of fatalities. This is my favorite verb tense by far, because most of the things you guys will be talking about have some starting point, but they're ongoing. They continue, and it's kind of indefinite. So the present perfect is just excellent for writing about, things that started at one point and are going on today. So subsequent to the accident, I'm saying at what point it started, industry leaders have attempted to make changes. Now, present perfect uses has or have before the verb, and it just allows the reader to know that it's kind of a fluid activity here. Here's another example. And since is another clue that we're going to be using the present perfect. Since the end of the Cold War, Western nations have focused on nuclear disarmament. It wouldn't make sense to use simple past and say Western nations focused on nuclear disarmament since the end of the Cold War, because it feels like you stopped the action when it just started. So use the simple present tense to describe contemporary events or perpetual activity. Tension in the South continues this week. You'd see that in the news. Very simple. But this is an example where if you used a different verb tense, it would sound strange, unless you're talking about a specific event. The American Red Cross provides medical care and sends supplies to victims of natural disasters. It always does this. So the present tense works. And again, like I said earlier, consult your style guide. It will give you more definite instruction about verb tense. In Chicago, usually the guidelines when you're talking about literature is to talk in the present tense or the present perfect. Active voice. Now, I don't mean just to plug my next workshop, but I do have a workshop that focuses specifically on active versus passive voice. I would encourage you to attend this workshop or visit it online. I have the slides and everything online. So I'm going to go over briefly about what passive voice looks like, how you would revise it, but if you want more details, we can go over it during that other workshop. So you're familiar with this structure right here, subject, verb, and object. But what happens when we write in the passive voice is we morph the sentence. Now, we don't know that we're doing it. It's something that is innate in us when we learn a language. It just happens. But it's really good to be able to tell when you're doing it and to know how to revise it. So basically, you move the object to the subject place. You add pesky to be in front of the verb. And then you have a prepositional phrase that uses the subject. So it completely flips your regular sentence construction around. So here are a couple examples. So I don't know how many times I see sentences like this. The risks were assessed by the analyst. You could simply just say the analyst assessed the risks. Now, more often times than not, I see the actual natural subject drop off completely. So I might see a sentence that is something like, the risks were assessed. Have you seen these sentences? The risks were assessed. You're like, by whom? I don't know. So the point of this is to show that the actor or the doer is quite important in the sentence. Now, the only exceptions to this would be when the actor is unknown. You want to draw attention to the natural object of the sentence. Say, for instance, you want to focus on the victim of a crime, not the perpetrator. That might be an appropriate time to use passive voice. And there are a couple other exceptions to the rule. But if you can, revise this and it makes your sentences fresher. It makes the action more obvious there. Okay, modifiers. I know this is a funny heading, but really what I'm trying to get at here is what not to do. How many of you have heard the term dangling modifier? Have you heard that term? Okay, and you look at your sentence, you're like, I don't know what I did. I don't know how I got here. It's confusing and I don't know how to fix it. So I've created a few slides to show what a dangling modifier looks like, and then how to fix it. So really, this isn't about all modifiers, all adjectives, and all modifying phrases. It's just about preventing dangling modifiers. So turn the introductory element into a subordinating clause or prepositional phrase. This is one way you can solve this dangling modifier. Touring the facility, the damage became apparent. What kind of question does this pose? Yeah. To whom, right? So as the inspectors toured the facility, the damage became apparent. So now I know there's an actor involved in this particular sentence. Here's another example of a difficult one. To recognize this problem early, corrosion has been studied. Whoa, there's something missing here. So for that, revise the passive construction into in the main clause to an active construction. So this would look like, to recognize this problem early, scientists have studied corrosion. Here's one more. After scrutinizing the problem, corrosion is now thought to have been the culprit. Can you hear that passive phrasing in there? After scrutinizing the problem, the inspectors think that corrosion is the culprit. So if you see a comment in your writing from an advisor or an instructor and it says dangling modifier, return to this, and I guarantee you've done one of these. Here's one other form. When present, inspectors know that corrosion is likely to result in infrastructure breaking down. Now, who is present here? When present, is it the corrosion or is it inspectors, right? When corrosion is present, inspectors know that it will likely break down infrastructure. Okay, parallelism. I am pushing through so you guys can go to the SGL. Yay! A whole afternoon of meetings. It's lovely, isn't it? Achieve parallelism in a sentence containing a list of words or phrases beginning with the same part of speech. Now, these aren't sentences, they're just lists, but it kind of gives you an idea of what you should be doing. In the first list, we have ing verbs, or you might want to call them gerunds if you're using them like nouns. I like running, biking, and jumping. The hospital, the conservatory, or the museum, we're listing things, places. Intelligent, creative, and resourceful. These are all adjectives. Seems really simple, right? But how many times when you're writing a resume, well, you guys are employed right now. But at some point you're going to have to write a resume, or you're going to have to sum up your experience. How easy is it to fall into this? Highly motivated, management, team player. Like, whoa, it's not organized, right? So we want to make sure the categories match as closely as possible. Achieve parallelism, oh my God, I can't say that word. Parallelism by ensuring list items follow from the same subject and verb. This is really important, and this is where you get caught up. Daniel's main concerns included receiving his paycheck on time, getting along with his coworkers, and earning a promotion within a year. Not receiving his paycheck, getting along with coworkers, and his boss. Usually, it's the last list item that strays from the pattern. Now, you may say, does this really matter? As human beings, we love patterns. And for a reader, it just makes sense. You don't want your reader to have to read the sentence, this one sentence, 2 or 3 times to understand what you're saying. Achieve parallelism by ensuring list items follow the same verb. This is the same thing as the last one, but it's a little bit different. An example. The author illustrated the reasons behind climate change, the impact climate change will have on our future, and the steps companies can take to reducing their carbon footprints. You can see we have all of the objects of the sentence as the list items. Another important way to keep parallelism in your sentences is to mind your correlative conjunctions. So this is one area of conjunctions that I did not talk about earlier because it just doesn't fit the same way that these do here for parallelism. So all correlative conjunctions obviously come in pairs, both and. between and, either, or, neither, nor, not only, but also, as, not, and but. So it's really important to make sure you have both of these in the sentence, but in just the right spots. Here are a couple examples. You're going to say both at base and at second base. Here you see both and before the prepositional phrases at the exact same point. Remember, parallelism is about following a pattern and keeping that pattern going. The difference between the teachers and the administration. Neither the meal nor the dessert arrived promptly. Here are a couple more difficult examples. So either the department supervisor or the store manager will have to find employment elsewhere. So the either goes before one noun and the or goes before the other noun in this one. The foreign publications were impossible both to read and to translate. Here, the both is part of these verbal phrases here at the end. You can also extend parallelism to lists, and I encourage you to do so because they stick out the most when you stray from the pattern. So here is one way you could punctuate a list and emphasize the parallelism there. The hiring process entails 1, interviewing applicants, comma, 2, weighing the strengths of each applicant, comma, and 3, selecting the best applicant for the position. If you're writing a thesis that is full of lists, this is one way you can make a list. You may have phrases in your list, but don't mix phrases and full sentences. You're straying from the pattern. It just makes it easier to read. It shows that you've put thought into what you're writing and you're not just throwing words on a page separated with commas. Signal phrasing. Now this is going to be tricky for us to get out on time. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. Use a combination. Now if you attended the earlier workshop, great. We went through all the punctuation involved with signal phrasing, but we have a couple extra areas. You have quotation marks, commas, periods, brackets, and ellipses, and you have elements of attribution. That means acknowledging the source of the quote. So you have the context, signal phrasing, blending, and in-text citations or footnotes. So I have signal phrasing 3 ways. I will go through these quickly. They are in your handout. Introduce a quote with the author's name, a verb, and a comma. This is the simplest way to introduce a quote. Now, my examples are literary examples, so please forgive that. Bradbury's Montague Laments, comma, and we have a double quote and a single quote because the book itself had quotation marks. I turned those into single quotes. Nobody listens anymore. I can't talk to the walls because they're yelling at me. I can't talk to my wife. She listens to the walls. I just want someone to hear what I have to say. Citation, period. Prophetic, right? Yeah. Okay. The next one, introduce a quote with an independent clause containing the author's name and a colon. Note the independent clause. That means I'm making a full sentence and a colon before I introduce the quote. So this one, Hamlet's gloomy atmosphere materializes, colon, and there's my quote. The third way is to introduce a quote without extra punctuation and blended right into your sentence. So the message that, quote, you forget what you want to remember and you remember what you want to forget, unquote, resonates throughout McCarthy's tale. Now, these are literary examples, but they do apply to you because you'll use the same principles in your work. Follow these and you'll never go wrong. Never start or end a paragraph with a quote. Always start with your own words or your analysis. Always provide analysis after a quote. In other words, do not let the quote speak for itself. We might call this a hit and run quote. Don't do it. Provide citations for summarized, paraphrased, and quoted work, all 3, and consult your style guide for other information. Now, a couple other things. These are side notes before we go into the last activity. I'm hoping to get you out here in 5 minutes. Use brackets to insert words into the quote. Now, don't insert words that will change the meaning of said quote, but if you need to change the verb tense, that's acceptable. Your style guides will also tell you what's acceptable. Email me later if you want to know what's acceptable for Chicago. That will also apply for IEEE, what's acceptable to change in a quote. Use brackets around the word sic, S-I-C, it's short for Latin. I can't remember the phrase. It means that there's a typo. The error is in the original quotation. It's not your error. So do not use an ellipsis at the beginning or the end of a quote. Okay? We assume that the quotation you're using is in the middle of things. Do not use an ellipsis as punctuation for a sentence within a quote. Add a period. That's one of the acceptable marks to add. And then you add the 3 dots for the ellipsis. Last activity. I hope you are excited. I have children's books. If you didn't feel like this was if you didn't already feel this is grammar school, take one, pass it on. I would like for you to take note of the author on the cover. I don't care about who illustrated the book. I want to see a perfectly executed quote with signal phrasing. And go. All right, here's the first one. I'm really excited about these, you guys. These are fun. In Dr. Seuss's Thidwick, I like that. You can shorten a title, by the way, if you want. You would have this in italics if you were typing it, because it's short for the title. Thidwick rejoices, comma. We have double quotes and single quotes because there were quotes in the book. I'm happy my antlers can be of some use. Very nice. The only thing I would do is if you have parenthetical citation, allow the period to be there. Very nice. Okay, lies, then that's the author, lies bats, quote, flutter homeward, drained and weary near the end of his book, colon, bats at the beach.
I wasn't sure about the colon. I wasn't.
Lies bats flutter near the end of his book. And you could simply, the only thing that hung me up a little bit was that colon, his book, bats at the beach. I like it, you blended it.
Okay. Well, you wouldn't need to do anything to highlight back to the beach to make sure that it was clear.
You would put this in italics if you're typing it, but I don't expect you to write slanted while we're writing here on the board. So I like that. So friend, we have our IEEE citation for the children's book. I think this is exciting, right? Friend 1, aptly described my cousins, colon, the 3 cackled and quacked and honked.
It's taken out of context.
It is taken out of context, but you did execute the quote correctly. You have the colon. I'm happy with it.
Is it okay that it's past tense described, or does it need to be present tense, or is that back together?
I'm not going to nitpick.
Okay.
I like this.
Sure.
Okay, here's one more. For now, we'll dream. Oh, this was a quote, by the way. Quote, for now, we'll dream of things we've read. Quote, is a favorite quote I like to tell during my kids' bedtime storytelling. Lies 15. I like that. It's nice and blended into the sentence. Sometimes that's even the hardest task to do, is to blend it. So Laura Numeroff notes, comma, quote, if you give a moose a muffin, he'll want some jam to go with it, end quote, and the citation. Very nice, very nice. I know you guys probably thought this was really silly when I started, but it's a nice way to practice quoting, and I think you all have done really well.